So I've been wanting to do a video talking about the new cut planner for a while, so let's jump in. For anyone who doesn't know what the cut planner in LightBurn does or what it's for, it is the part of LightBurn that decides what order to cut your project in. And so if I create a bunch of things in a fairly arbitrary order, now I've actually made this bad intentionally. If I don't have the cut planner active, then LightBurn just cuts these shapes in the order that I created them in. And that is rarely what I want. You can see all of these really long travel moves in between things that are pretty terrible. So if I have the default settings enabled, which are order by layer, cut inner shapes first, and reduce travel moves. Now, these are the optimization settings, and these control how the cut planner orders the things in your project. So if I have the default settings on, you can see that now it's cutting these things in a fairly logical order, and the amount of travel that it's making is minimized. That's usually what you want. So there are also a couple of options that control other parts of this. One of them being cut inside shapes first. If I were to cut the outside square here before cutting the inside circle, and I had my workpiece elevated above the bed on pins, like some people have, cutting this outside shape would mean that the whole square would fall, and I would never have the chance to cut this inner circle. If you cut the circle first and the circle falls out, you don't really care because the outer square is still held in place, and when it gets cut, it will drop and it's already done. So having the cut inner shapes first setting on is generally what you want. And so you can see here, it cuts the inner circle, then moves on to the outside square, cuts the inner circle, does the outside square, and so on. Also available are some slightly more interesting options. So if I do this, LightBurn by default has scan all shapes at once set. And so with the default options, you'll see that it does, it's cutting the cuts first because I've told it to, and that's bad. So let's fix that. So now I've got my scans first. So the scan is going to happen first, and that's good. But it's scanning everything all at the same time and then going after the fact and doing the outline cuts. If your machine is well tuned and fast, this is ideal. Scanning everything all in one swoop is a good idea, and it gets you the most efficient use of your machine time for people who have fast machines. If you have a slower machine or a diode-based machine, this is probably not what you want. And if your machine is a little bit loose or skips steps occasionally or anything like that, doing all of these scans together and then going back and doing the circles around them mean that if your workpiece shifts or you lose some steps along the way, when you were cutting the outlines at the end, they're probably going to be shifted. And that means you've lost all of these pieces. So there are some new options available. Number one, you can say scan groups together. Now I've set up this file so that each of these objects is a group. And that means that by saying scan groups, for example here, we'll use this ambulance as an example. If I say just cut selected graphics, you can see it's scanning all of these pieces together that make up this ambulance in one go, and then doing the outline. If I have scan shapes individually set, what happens is each of those pieces, the little light on top, then the body, then the wheels, then the cab, get scanned individually, and that's going to take more time. If you set scan groups together, then because I have all of these pieces grouped, it does this all in one shot and then does the outline, and that's what I want. So with this file, I have each of these shapes grouped, as I've said. There is a new option in the optimization settings to say order by group. So if I remove the order by layer and just say order by group, I also have cut inner shapes first, And because these scans are all inside these outer shapes, this is probably just going to do what I want. And so now you can see it's going to scan each item and then do the outline and move on to the next one. And it's doing these such that it's finishing each fully grouped item before moving on to the next grouped item. So if I had to stop this partway through my cut, everything that I've cut up to the point that I stop it would be a usable part. So if the machine skips or something happens, it's really going to only affect that one piece and not everything else in the cut. If you have cuts that are a lot of small individual pieces, this works really well. If your cut is one large giant piece that all has to work together, then you're kind of out of luck and you need a well-tuned machine, but this will help. Another of the options that is new, I'm going to bring in a different file. If you say reduce direction, or sorry, pardon me, choose best starting point. So we're going to show you what this does without. Normally, LightBurn will pick the starting point of the object based on how that object was created. So these used to be squares, and I bent the sides, and so you can see that it's going to start on the corners of them, and the circles all start from the same point. They're modeled from here, and so on. So every circle starts from this side and goes around this way, and every square starts at the upper corner and goes down. That may not be the best starting location. So in this case, you can see that we're starting up here at the origin, moving all the way across the shape to the far side, and then cutting around. There's a setting to choose the best starting point, which improves that. So now you can see that instead of going all the way to the other side of this circle, it starts close to the upper corner and then jumps immediately to the nearest point on this shape and travels around it, and so on. This is significantly faster, and you can see that my travel moves here are 2,112 millimeters, or about 21 seconds. If I just say don't choose the best starting point, you can see now I've got 2,600 millimeters in 26 seconds. So it takes a little longer and I do a little more traveling. The problem with this is that if your machine has any backlash at all and you start somewhere in a shape that is arbitrary, particularly on curved shapes, so these, for example, these bowed squares, if I start in the middle here and move around the shape and the end of my cut doesn't exactly match the start of my cut, you'll get little offsets. And because you're in the middle of a long line, they'll be quite visible. So there is now an option to say choose corners if possible. And what that does is we'll start at a corner if it can find one, but still choose an optimal starting point. So you can see here, it's chosen the arbitrary starting point on the circle and then chosen the closest corner on this shape. And it will choose the closest corner on the next shape, and so on. So in addition to that, we also have cut in direction order. So I can say I want to cut things from top, bottom, left, or right. So without this enabled, you can see that this cut progresses somewhat randomly. It starts down the side, bounces back up again, then does these parts, then jumps down to the bottom. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Some people happen to like things to progress in an orderly direction. So if you say cut in a direction from top, now it will do the top and travel along and then fill in the bottom. If you say cut from left, it's going to try to cut things from the left side toward the right side. This can be important if, for example, your machine exhausts over here. You may want to cut items on one side before you move to the side where the exhaust is, so that you don't have smoke blowing over freshly cut parts of your project. There are other reasons that people want to do this. You may want to cut from the bottom up, from the top down, whatever, and LightBurn will now allow you to do this. Choose best direction allows LightBurn to reverse if necessary, and I'll show why or how that's useful. Let's draw something relatively simple. So if I have a little petal shape, like a flower, I'm going to make a few of them. If I have my default settings enabled, which are cut inner shapes, reduce direction changes, pardon me. Oh, pardon me. Cut inner shapes and reduce travel moves. So these are the defaults. You can see each of these petals is cut one at a time, and as it gets here to the end, it slows down, changes direction to do the next one. And so we've got a lot of direction changes. At each end, it reverses to do the next one because they're close. This isn't a bad thing, but it's maybe not the most efficient way to do this. If you enable reduce direction changes, the cut plan is a little different. Now you can see that LightBurn has decided that it's faster to jump across to do the next shape than it was to pick one that involved a direction change nearby. There is a threshold or a cutoff that's built in, so it tries to pick things that are smart. But this, if I were to run this on my machine, would take less time than the other version because it's not stopping with each of these petal cuts. It's basically continuing at speed, moving across the shape, finding another thing nearby. That's going to be faster and take less time than reversing constantly. So that option is useful. It may not be the thing you want all the time, but for things like this, it's very, very useful. You can also see it in play if I do something like this. If I take this shape and replicate it a bunch and tell LightBurn to cut this, you can see that because I started this from here and drew it this way, it's going to cut that line and then move to the next line and move to the next line and so on. And it's going to cut these in a zigzag. And you can see there it's returning to the starting point of the next line, cutting that line, returning to the starting point of the next line, cutting that line, and so on. This is actually a little bit easier to see if I make this a smooth path and bend it just a little bit so that you can actually watch the cut happen. So I'll create an array of these. And so now you can see it cuts that one, scans across, cuts this one, scans across, cuts this one, and so on. And so it's cutting them all from left to right. Now, if I change the optimization settings to reduce direction changes and choose the best starting point, and choose the best direction, in this case, that is important. So choose the best direction means that for an open shape, LightBurn is allowed to decide which end to start it from. And so in this case, you can see that rather than jumping all the way across the shape to go here and cut this way, it's decided that, well, this end was closer to where I started, so I'm going to cut there. And it's going to cut these in a zigzag, which is a much faster way to do this. So you can see the number of rapid moves here takes about 4 seconds. If I turn off the choose best direction and choose best starting point, now you can see that the number of rapid moves is very high and it takes about 1 minute and 13 seconds to execute them. So much better to turn on the choose best starting point and choose best direction. There's also a new option that's coming. This isn't released yet, but it will be released in the 8.07 version. and that is remove overlapping lines. And so something that happens often, let's do a simple shape inside this. So I'm going to make a grid of these. And I'm going to set them to have no gap in between. And so what that means is instead of a space in between all of these lines, they are now touching. And that means that there are duplicates. So each of these squares is now 2 lines, or there are 2 lines here overlapping one another. And if I cut this, it's going to cut every one of those lines doubled. Now RDWorks has an option to remove overlaps, and it works. The problem with it is that it affects cut planning. And so if I want to cut inner shapes first, but I have removed all of those overlapping lines, then these shapes would no longer actually be squares. So as an example, if this was my shape, let me turn this into a path so that I can edit it, and I want to delete these. So in RDWorks, if I said remove overlapping lines, this might be the shape that I get, like that. The problem with this is that this shape doesn't have an inside. So this has no idea whether it is inside this square or not. In order for it to know whether it is inside something, the something has to actually have sides. And so here it does. But now the problem is that these lines are duplicates. So in LightBurn, we've added the option to remove overlapping lines as part of the cut planner. And so the cut planner can figure out what is inside of what, and then go back and cut the other pieces. And so you can see here that it has cut the inside shape, and then it's cut whatever was left of the square that used to surround it, and so on. And so it's going to do the right thing all the way to the end. We will have the option to allow you to remove overlapping lines as part of the project before too long. But having it integrated into the cut planner means that the inside-outside sorting isn't affected, and so I actually thought it was more useful to do it this way first, in addition to being simpler. I think we have covered everything except for order by priority, and that is a new one which allows you to specify the absolute order that you want things cut in LightBurn. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to do a simple shape. Let me do this guy, and I'll just make a small handful of them. So these circles I've created, they are all the same. If I use my default cut settings, we'll go back all the way down to just cut inner shapes first and reduce travel moves. It's just going to cut these in some order that makes sense, and that's fine. If, let's say, I wanted all of these ones cut first and then these ones cut later, I can change the cut order property in here. And so these ones I want cut after the other ones. So I'm going to set them to 1, and all of these ones are still set to 0. So that cut order in the optimization settings, if I say order by priority, means that LightBurn will do all of those shapes first and then do all of these shapes, and still do all of the other planning that I have told it to do in addition to that. And so if I wanted to get even more specific and say, hey, I want to cut these ones first, I can make those -1, I can make these 0, I can make those 1, and I'll make, say, these ones 2. It's just a number and basically a low number cuts first and a higher number cuts later. And so now you can see it's going to cut that group first, and then that group, and then this group, and then that group. The benefit of this is that it actually lets you go as far as fully manual cut planning, if that's honestly what you want to do. So if I wanted these shapes to always cut in a very, very specific order, I can use the shape properties and say, I want this to be number 0, I want this one to be number 1, I want this one to be number 2, I want this one to be number 3, and I want this one, pardon me, to be number 4. And this is exactly what it'll do. And again, within that cut ordering, all of the other things still hold true. So I can say I want to order by group and then order by priority. I can say I want to order by priority first and then order by group within that. I can say I want to order by layer first, then by priority, then by group, and so on. And the way that this works is it will apply this first, and then whatever falls out of this is then passed on to the next thing. And so any whole group in here will now get passed to the priority thing. So an entire layer at a time will then get sorted by priority. If I put groups first, for example, then within a group it would order by layer, and then within a layer it would order by priority, and so on. So this gives you the ability to do very, very complicated things with your cuts. And it should allow for pretty much any possible ordering that you might want, particularly when combined with all of the other things like directional ordering and so on. That was a little longer than I wanted. However, hopefully you've learned something, and happy cutting.